Thank you, everyone. Thanks for choosing my talk this afternoon. It's not the very first time I've ever given this talk, and some folks do occasionally say in conversations that I'm in, well, naming is hard. And while a catchphrase is nice, the whole title is, naming is hard, let's do better. And that part is really what this is about. Because it's easy to tell people, oh, you know, when you're diving into legacy code or when you're rejuvenating an old project or those sorts of things, make sure you give things good names. And then there's a little pause, and then someone changes the subject. Because the actual mechanics of how do you give things good names is, well, hard. And I'm not going to give you rules that will generate names for you. I'm going to tell you things to care about that will guide your thoughts and your arguments when you're settling the names of things. See, naming really matters, and it matters everywhere. The names in our code, the names of variables, the names of functions, the names of everything, are how we work out what we're doing. When you say the taxes is the total times the tax rate, those words, they're the explanation of your algorithm. And to each other, to the customer, to the person who's claiming there's an error in your report, because for some reason in their universe the taxes are wrong, like all of that involves the names for the symbols that we're manipulating. And if there's one thing C++ is bad at, it's naming things. RAII, anyone? Stands for, of course, Scope Bound Resource Management. We got lots of terrible names. People say that West Const should be called Const West. Not sure about that. But the famous ones are the examples where there's a class called, lowercase a, and then you make instances of it called uppercase a, or someone else does it the other two ways around. Single letter variable names, things that differ only by case. We have a lot of really, really bad behaviors in our naming, but naming is a learned skill. Some people might just be natural-born namers. They're amazing, and you just sit back in awe while they name everything correct. But that's not the only way to be a good namer. You can get better at it, and you can learn some ways to practice and to improve the naming that you're doing. I'll tell you what I'm not going near. I'm not going near any of this stuff. Uppercase, lowercase, camel case, snake case, scared by an underscore as a small child, so they're banned in your code base. None of that. To me, that's all very bike sheddy. I mean, just have a standard, stick to that. This is not about whether it's employee with a capital E or a lowercase e. This is about, is it employee or is it associate or is it a person who has an employment contract object, right? Not how you actually type the letters. And of course, you have tools to let you mess about if you change your mind about your naming conventions in the terms of capital letters and underscores. Names are where the meanings come from. A real thing that I ran into was things that are only valid for a while, and then they're not. And when we say for a while, and then there's a date, what do you call that? You could call it the inactive date, you could call it the end date, you could call it the expiry date. And it turns out it matters. Because you find yourself in a meeting saying, well, can you use something on the end date? And I have to tell you that in circles I found myself in, they all agreed that you couldn't use things on their end or inactive dates, but you could on their expiry dates. Okay? Now, as a programmer, that makes no sense. First of all, I would have really done a date and time, right? It's valid until the 11th at 9:30 a.m. But then people don't like that. They want it to just be valid till the 11th, and then is it valid on the 11th, midnight, the very, very end of the 11th? And naming it often settles those business rules in a way that's not at all clear to the programmers who are then going to write that code. But the business users carry meanings here. This is trick questions. Who knows the answer? Does empty a collection? No. It tells you whether or not it's empty. Clear empties a collection. Now, many people will tell me that names are important when you're writing a public API for strangers, but that there's a lower standard of care when you're maybe just writing a tutorial. This is just slides. It wouldn't fit if I used their real names. I'm just going to call them ABC. But then I read this tweet from Nicole, and it's quite an old tweet now, but it's still just as sad as it ever was. Nicole says, it's really hard to follow examples with single-letter variables. Okay. She says, if you're trying to teach coding, could you be more descriptive, not just ABC? So far, so good, right? This is what makes this tweet sad. Newbies can shorten them once they feel comfortable. Oh no, what are we teaching people, right? We don't need those crutches of syllables, words, please. We are experienced experts. Everything is ABC. But I learned this a long time ago. What we show people in our coding examples is what we are teaching people. And that's why names matter from the very, very get-go. They tell a story. The better you name things, the less comments you need. It's one of our arguments for refactoring, that instead of having a 400-line loop, let's write a function. We'll give the function a name, and then everyone will know what that does. Well, what if the story you're telling is not actually what the code does, and you're misleading people? This happens. Here's what happens over time. I do a lot of things where I come into code that's existed for a long time. And this is like the evolution of set status. It starts out simple. You know it does this. It takes a status, and it's called set status. You just know there's a member variable called status that gets set to that parameter. Done. Okay. Until, we have this like audit thing. We keep track of when everything was touched last. So all the sets, because there could be a bunch of other set whatevers, they all need to say last updated. Don't worry about how we got the current time. That's not the point of the story. Okay. Carry along, we're doing okay, until someone says, oh, you know what? When you set it to approved, there's a bunch of special stuff has to happen. And when you set it to denied, there's a bunch of special stuff has to happen. And those dots, they just get longer and longer and longer, and they get bugs in them. And the person looking for the bug doesn't think to look in set status, because as far as they're concerned, status equals S. They look at the name of set status. That's the code for it. Set status is not a true name anymore. It's misleading. You probably want to do a function called approve and a function called deny. Now it's not surprising if you have a bug related to sending emails or whatever the dot is, that it would be in these like business logic kind of functions. They have a name that tells people things happen here. Whereas set status has a name that says, nothing to see here, just passing along this parameter that you gave me. Approve and deny are less deceptive. That means that you don't always get the names right at first. Set status was an okay name for status equals S. Done. It only became a bad name as the body of the function grew. I learned from some folks who do a lot of refactoring that there's a real school of thought that when you first extract those couple hundred lines into a function, when it prompts you for the name of the function, you just smack your fingers down on the keyboard. That's how I got that constellation of letters. I did just that on my keyboard. Don't put any thought into it, because you'll be wrong. Like, don't worry about it. You don't know what it does yet. You haven't read it, right? It's 400 lines that you happen to have selected in the editor. Just give it any old name. You'll fix it if it's nonsense. You also see this. Here's what I think it does. It sets the shipping cost, it adjusts the total, it marks it as shipped, right? Then later you go, oh, this is ship. That's called ship when you ship the product. Actually, this is not really accurate because you don't know what it sets. It should be called set D4, adjust RB17, and set the X7 flag, right? Then later, as you work your way through the function and you work out what all these weirdly named local variables are, you actually figure out what the function's doing, and you're actually able to name the function. The true name will come. It may take time. That's all right. Don't be paralyzed, unable to move forward because you don't know what to name it yet. Remember that you will change names a lot. And we have tools. It's not too hard. To give a thing a good name, you have to think about who is consuming it. So if I've got 50,000 lines of code to update and refactor, the consumer of all these function names is me. And I like me, so that works out pretty well. When I'm writing some utility object that my team is going to be using throughout this project, I kind of know how my team thinks. I know our words for things. I've got the binders and the wikis and everything full of them. Not hard to think their way and give them a name. But as you get further and further from the consumers of these names, you have to really actively work about putting yourself in their shoes and thinking like them and naming it in a way that makes sense for them. I expect that some of you have seen or heard me talk about things related to algorithm header, right? Sean is here this year, which is nice because Sean's really responsible for awakening me to how that header changes if you actually just use it. So when I complain, and I am about to complain, I'm complaining from love. I told this story first to a non-programmer but technical person. I told them about sort. You know how this works. You have a bunch of thingies, and you call sort, and now they're in order. Okay? But what if my thingies are not integers that fit on the slide? They are purchase orders. Okay? And I want to sort the purchase orders by their value. Great. But purchase orders are fairly large items. Moving them around inside a vector is expensive, and I have 10,000 purchase orders, and I really just want to know the 4 or 5 that are worth the most. I don't want to pay for sorting the entire container. That could be expensive. Okay. The implementers are like, we got you. We got partial sort. Right? Partial sort will just bring, in this case, the 3 smallest integers, but in my other case, my 4 best purchase orders to the beginning of the collection. And then who cares who was number 500 and who was number 501 out of my 10,000? I don't care. Just want to know the best ones. Okay. But that permuted the collection. Maybe it's not a problem with integers, but maybe with my purchase orders, they were sorted by date or by sales rep or something, and now I've sorted them by value, and I've messed up that sort and have to redo it. Again, standard library has your back. We have partial sort copy, right? Which takes just the winners, puts them in their own place, gives the original collection its own former glory, unpermuted, untouched. And understand, I do think it's great that we have partial sort copy, but it's a terrible, terrible name. It's an implementer's name, and it's the name that comes from that story of, so I sorted them, and then it was expensive, and then I la la la. Because the person who wants the 4 purchase orders that are worth the most, well, they don't want to sort anything. They want top N. Not sort, not any kind of sort. Now, because this is C++ and we're super pedantic, many people point out that, like, that's not top N. It's really top N sorted. Okay? If you just wanted, like, 4 followed by 1 followed by 2, that would be the non-existent nth element copy. And maybe we should have nth element copy, but maybe we shouldn't call it that. The people designing the standard library to this day are outnumbered by people using the standard library by, I don't know, millions. And they have to think like people who couldn't write a C++ compiler. They have to think like people who couldn't design a standard library to come up with names that make sense to people who are very, very different from themselves. And it's super hard. Some things that will help you. Be consistent. We write code and we put words like tax rate and total and region and expiry date, not just in our variable and function and class names. We put out reports, and the columns on the reports have headings. We send emails that say the expiry date of your, I don't know, coupon or special offer is coming up soon. We have UIs with places for people to enter the expiry date. And then people call each other and say, I don't understand why I can't use it. Today is the 11th, and its expiry date is the 11th. Why can't I use it? These words have to be the same in all of those places. Otherwise, these conversations are almost impossible to have. This means being really firm with people who phone you up and say inactive date when it's really expiry date. You kind of have to correct them and make sure they're using the right names. Now, ideally, the names would come from the business to the programmers, but the reality is a lot of names come from the programmers to the business. Fine, at least let's be consistent. Let's not use 6 different names in 6 different contexts for the same thing. I will correct someone on the phone. No, your certification expired. It's your coupon that's invalid. It seems like a pointless pedantry, but it's how you keep the reports and the thinking and the emails and the code all working together. However, there's a tendency in terms of programming to want to name things that didn't have names before. Really try to let other people tell you the names if you can. So I have this function. I'm trying to refactor it, trying to figure out what it does. And I've found that there's the stuff we do before we load it, and there's the loading, and there's the stuff we do after. And it's really, really tempting to just do this, right? Well, there's the preload, and then there's the load, and then there's the postload. Okay, but these names, they don't tell you anything. Like, this is all slideware. There is no load function. I didn't have to write it. But you could maybe guess what load does, but you cannot tell at all what pre and post load do. You can see when they happen, but you could also see that if they had another name because you're able to read code, right? You understand how control flows like this down the page. So there's 0 information in these names. They're easy to come up with, but they don't really help people. If all of the preload stuff is about checking permissions and authorizations or acquiring a lock, something like that, then that should be its name. If all of the postload is about sending confirmatory emails or whatnot, then that should be its name. Figure out what it does, not just when it happens. We're also really good at update config file. First of all, to most of us, config file is a real simple and ordinary and obvious name and not anything complicated or technical at all. I have to tell you, there are people who are not in this room who don't feel that way. But like, save is understood. Why not call it save? Why are you calling it update config file? I'm old enough to have watched where we keep information undergo huge paradigm shifts multiple times. So there were ini files, which were small files in the same folder as the executable. And there was easy APIs to read values out of the ini files. Then big migration, so all gonna be the registry. Then there was this, now it's the cloud, now it's something else. If it was just called like load preferences and save preferences the whole time, you wouldn't need to keep naming it. Why does the fact that it's stored in a config file need to be in the name of the function? And just pedantic stuff like storage coordinates instead of location. The location's what it is. The storage coordinates is how you are implementing that. If you keep the implementation details out of the names, you will not have to change the names when you change the implementation details. I speak 1.5 natural languages, English and some French. We say in Canada, a lot of us, that we're sesquilingual. That's 1.5. But even if English isn't your natural language, your first language, you probably recognize, if you stop for a while to think, that certain pairs go together. Like begin and end, not begin and last. It's first and last, always. Create and destroy, not create and clean up. Open and close, not open and release. And next and previous, not next and rewind. That would be forward and rewind. And put and get, not put and retrieve. These don't have to make sense. You can't necessarily look them up in a dictionary, but they are the pattern that we're all used to. It's source and destination, not source and target. If you're not sure, you can take a survey amongst your immediate coworkers or do a poll on the social media of your choice as to which of these pairs is more natural. But people get confused when the pairs don't match. I really strongly these days advise against metaphor. There are lots of reasons to have a problem with metaphor. The most important one is that not everyone has your background. There's a group of people, especially in North America, who grew up watching cowboy movies where the good cowboys had white hats and the bad cowboys had black hats, and they talk about like white hat hacking and black hat hacking. But if you are, less than 70, it's possible you didn't grow up watching cowboy movies, and you may not have any understanding what this hat color metaphor is all about. Even when people recognize your metaphor, many of them have too many possible meanings, like red and green. Is stop and go, begin and end, port and starboard? It's probably port and starboard, right? There's so many different things represented with red and green. I consulted once on a project to help companies design traffic maps. When you go and you see that and we actually had a section on if you only have 3 colors, use red for stopped and yellow for slow and green for fast. It was a government project. We wrote it all out. What if you have 5 colors? What if you have 11 colors? There was a place that had their speed traps on their traffic maps. And sometimes the speed traps were green. And I was like, does that mean that it's on and operating and you'll get a ticket if you speed through it? Or does it mean like, green, go ahead, hit the gas, go as fast as you like, we're not here today, right? There's no obvious color for how to color whether your speed trap is on or off. So if you would like to make a white list and a black list, red properties and green properties, don't assume that whoever is reading your code will know what it means. Better to actually use the right word, like allow and deny, operating, inactive, stuff like that, rather than metaphors, especially metaphors that could be misinterpreted. Like, I don't know what filter does. If I have a list of integers and I call filter and I pass in some kind of a predicate to indicate oddness, am I filtering 2 just odd numbers, or am I filtering out the odd numbers? I can't tell from the name filter. But if I called it include if and exclude if, then it's much more obvious. Because filter is also a metaphor, right? Like a coffee filter. And sometimes what you want is the liquid without the solids, and other times what you want is the solids. So you really can't tell from just the word filter what it's supposed to do. When you rely on a metaphor, you rely on someone's background, you rely on them guessing correctly amongst the many possible metaphors you could be meaning. Just don't make people guess. Just be super literal. All right, let's be specific. What if I'm writing a function? When you are writing a function, you are going to use a verb. There's a version of the Strunk and White style rules that breaks the rules to explain what they're doing, and one of them is this sentence, no verb. Functions should have verbs. Calculate, deduct, mark, right? Verbs related to what your program does. If there isn't an obvious one, some helpers that are useful include is empty. Now I know that that's going to return me a true or false about whether or not a collection is empty. And small editorial, but whole talk's editorial. If you got to put no discard on your function because nobody ever looks at the return value, then you gave it a name that didn't make people want to look at the return value. Okay, like I'm glad we have no discard, but if you find yourself having to use it, you're doing it wrong and you should change the name of your function. So is empty, much more obvious. There's also has whatever and can whatever. So imagine you have an order which might or might not be ready to ship, and you want to ask. You could call that function is shippable, and it would return true or false. Not that shippable is really a word. Maybe it is. Maybe the staff in that company all walk around saying, we can't send order 1, 2, 3, 4, it's not shippable. In which case, I guess, is shippable's okay. You could have can ship, yes or no. And you could have get ship status that will return you an enum, which you could compare to all of the enums that correspond as being ready to ship now. It matters. There's also this. Do you have ready to ship, which returns true or false? And you may or may not see it, but there is a bang before ready to ship. So if not ready to ship, or do you call the function not ready to ship? Because that's what people are always checking. Well, I guess maybe that's less ambiguous. I don't know. I see this all the time. If not is invalid, right? We didn't write a valid, we only wrote invalid. Sorry to Visual Studio. I love Visual Studio, but I hate this option, and there are so many of them. Disable squiggles false. How is that not enable squiggles true? What? Right? Because this is their, like internally, some things are on by default, so you have to set disable whatever, but I'm not really clear what disable squiggles false might mean. However, once you bring in your little helper verbs, we have to talk about order. Is it verb noun or noun verb? We don't say, now I will tax determine, right? I'm going to determine the taxes. I'm going to charge the fees. But we do employee update. We do inventory check. So there's no like hard and fast single rule. It seems to go by how you want to think about the sentence. But you should be making deliberate choices. Sometimes the tools affect the choice. There's a lot of places that'll show you all your classes, functions, member variables, whatever, in alphabetical order. So if you have a bunch of has this, can that, they'll all be together. But maybe you'd really rather that they would be important stuff first rather than helper verb first. Like if I have to type H-A-S and then a real first letter before the drop-down fills in, maybe I would have been happier if ship was at the beginning of the word. All right, if there's has entries and has risks, do I want those together alphabetically, or do I want everything entry related together and everything risk related together? Get and add, for example. Functions, of course, take parameters, arguments, and they serve two different purposes. Like, yes, they are local variables when you write the function. And so you have to name them the way we're going to go over some variable namings in a moment. I do not like shadowing, right? So if there's a member variable x, I don't like a function to take a parameter called x. Usually there's a way around it. If there's no way around it and you have to decorate, please do not decorate the argument or the parameter to the function. Decorate the member variable. And the reason is the other purpose is that these are cues to the people who are calling the code. So if I want to create a new hire object and I need to pass some stuff to the employee constructor, this is a little pop-up that reminds me the first parameter is the full name, the second parameter is the yearly salary. And it's not a coincidence that there are adjectives in those names to help you understand. Maybe I'll just keep salary as the member variable, but yearly salary for the constructor parameter. Now it's a prompt that lets you know whether it's the hourly, monthly, or whatever. Classes are nouns, and I don't like nouns that end verbally. Formatter, printer, organizer, controller. What do they format, print, normalize, whatever? If they print a report, could we at least call it report printer? If they organize a schedule, could we at least call it schedule organizer? Interestingly, when I get people to do that, sometimes they then abandon the verb. So it goes from printer to report report. It goes from schedule organizer, from organizer to schedule. And that's a good and sensible progress. You want to be nouns. People do like to decorate these nouns. whatever proxy, whatever factory, whatever adapter, whatever interface, monad, singleton, abstract, base, impl. Sometimes you need that to be able to tell them all apart. There's a whole pile of things that all involve a schedule. There's a schedule factory and a schedule adapter and a schedule proxy, like, okay. But if there's nobody else with that name, do you have to put this little decoration on the end to tell everybody what kind of class it is? Like inventory singleton instead of inventory? I don't think so. I still see people putting project names as like the first 4 letters of every class they're writing. And I was cured of this when MFC came out, which is maybe 1991, anyone-ish, right? Okay, because most of the functions in there started with the letters AFX, which is, of course, stands for MFC, and that's obvious, right? That was the code name application framework, I believe. Did not survive to release date, and yet it lived on in all these function names. You have a namespace if you have to, but look at projects change, code names change. Do not start all of your classes with 3 or 4 letters that represent your product. That will not stick around. Other thing people do? Well, we have a class called name and address, which later we have to rename to name and address and phone number, and name and address and phone number and email. What are you doing? That's your contact information, right? And now it can keep that name as the implementation details inside, wax and wane. Imagine adding fax number and then taking it away again 5 or 10 years later. Think about the purpose of the class. This is a real thing. Absolute orientation, Euler angles, fusion algorithm using accelerometer and magnetometer test. This is the proof. This is a screenshot from Patricia, who's here. Okay? That's the name. I mean, would you call a bed like a horizontal surface for sleeping with legs? What is it for? The thing must have a purpose. Same applies when you start to name the members of your class. Really don't like seeing the class name repeated in the members. Like employee has an employee name. Employee prints an employee record. Like, yes, I didn't think it was going to print a landscaping record, you know? I'll give you an exemption for employee record if it says employee record across the top in big letters and people talk about it that way in the break room. Oh, we're going to have to print an employee record for that guy. Okay, then you can call it print employee record. But for everything else, don't repeat the names. One reason that people do is because there'll be a lot of similar things. So an employee might have their own name as well as their manager's name and their, department name, and they sort of want to equally decorate all of them. Maybe in that case, but it sounds to me like there's some refactoring needed in that case. I mentioned adjectives earlier. Whether it's member verbals or function parameters, adjectives are totally your friend. If it's just called name, I don't know if that's their whole name or just their last name. Is it first comma last? Is it last comma first? Is there spaces between them? What about people who have spaces in their names? At least if you call it full name, I understand you're not breaking it into parts for me. This is their whole name. Same with salary. Salary per what? Per month, per year, per hour. I don't like string at the end of strings or int at the beginning of ints or any kind of decoration of type except for date. And I think, again, that's because when we talk about things, if I were to ask you in conversation, what is the name of the customer? I wouldn't say, what's the customer's name string, right? But I might say, what was the order's placement date? So sometimes we do stick date on the ends of things more than any other type. But for things that are strings, for things that are flags, like true or false, don't encode the type in the name. Talked about natural pairs. There's another form of pair issue. I meet this in real code. This is terrible. We have max, which is shortened, and minimum, which is not. And we have lowercase whatever and capital whatever. And that's because they didn't used to be a max or they didn't used to be a min, right? And a different person added the other one. But they produce a single artifact, which is today's code. And today's code doesn't care about what order it was written in or who wrote which parts of it. And when these find, oh, here's max whatever. Is there a min whatever? So I search for min underscore lowercase whatever, don't find it. Oh, apparently there isn't. Well, yeah, there is. So be consistent. There's also this, whatever max, but min whatever. Again, pick one, stick with it. Or we're consistent within each pair, min temp and max temp, but not between pairs. We have volume underscore min and volume underscore max. And this is probably about the person wanting all the volume stuff together rather than all the mins together and then all the maxes together, and I can see that. But to the extent that you can, have a preference. It could be that we always do min underscore and then the thing. It could be that we always do the thing underscore and min. I'm not going to have an opinion. Just don't be the first bullet, whatever else you do. There are certain member functions in your class that either you don't get to choose the name at all, or if you give them this name, we'll all know what they do. So if you have a constructor and you have a destructor that actually do stuff, right? So the constructor opens the file. The destructor closes the file. Everyone will understand that. Everyone knows what causes constructors and destructors to run. You don't need to explain much. But if they're called initialize and tear down, you have to, and you have to remind people to call them. There's also get and set. Lots of reasons to hate get and set, but giving them names like load and save are not better. Read, fetch, load, retrieve should not be used for something whose code is return whatever. Go ahead and call that get whatever. Fetch and read and load can be for going over the network or for opening a file or whatever it is, searching the database that you need to do that's longer than that. People do expect your get thingy to be const. If it can't be, then maybe you shouldn't call it get thingy, right? I meet students, by the way, who think that get thingy means prompt the user for a value and save it in the object. I don't know why, but they do. So be aware that not everyone has the same intuition as everyone else. This was real popular when I first started. Oh, we don't have properties because reflection is still 5 years away. It's been 5 years away for a real long time. We could do this. We could have two functions, both called capital T temperature. Right? We're just overloading on the parameters. The one that doesn't take any parameters returns you the temperature. The one that takes a parameter is the set. None of those pesky verbs for us. You can certainly find people who like to do this. You can also find people who really, really, really hate it. You should know which kind of team you're in. Class enums, enum classes, scoped enums, whatever, generally better than our older style enums because otherwise you end up encoding the enum name into it. Like everyone's got an OK, so there's NT OK, SB OK, blah, blah, blah. I would rather you didn't repeat the enum name. The whole point is that you don't have to repeat the enum name. But this also brings up the situation of enums leaking out. So we had that set status, which took an application status. And now all the code that wants to interact with an application has to understand the application status enum. That's not always the best choice. So sometimes when you're thinking about who's going to consume the enum, when you're naming it, you actually end up changing your API so that less people have to consume that enum. When we switch to approve and deny, suddenly nobody cared what the enum was for your possible statuses. Right? This is testing to see if something's approved or not. I could call get status and compare it to approved, or I could ask if it was approved. This is not a hard function to write, right? You know how it's one line long, but you're changing the API you're offering, and that's part of thinking about naming. Local variables. I didn't used to have this slide, and then people would say to me, but there's this time when a short variable is the correct answer. So, okay, fine. Let's deal with that. Calling your loop variable index or current index or position in collection is not helping compared to calling it I. Guaranteed. You might not even be correct to use a loop, but if you are correct to use a loop, having I or J or K in your loop is not your problem. That's not what's wrong with your code, if anything is. If you're doing scientific calculations, You do not take something that's T in the formula in the textbook and call the variable time inside your function, or take V and call it velocity. Super confusing. Use the notation the formulas use. And there's another example I will grant you, exemption I'll grant you, and that's when the scope is really tiny. So when you're talking about a person, you don't say their whole name every time. If you're talking about me, you might say Kate Gregory the first time, and then after a while you might say Kate, and then you might say she. And it gets shorter and shorter, but we all know because of the very small scope who you're talking about. No one thinks you suddenly mean my mother in the middle of the paragraph. So if you have a little piece of code like this, get next response, gives you back some string, which we're then going to consume in this while loop until it's empty, and then we're never going to look at it again, because when we get out of this loop, R is empty, it has nothing to offer us, it's not useful. Just being called R kind of tells you that we're never going to look at it again. It's a weak signal, but it's a signal. So if you reserve your single letter kind of throwaway variable names for things with tiny scopes, that signal is available to you. Wouldn't be wrong to have called it responses, but you can use really small names here. Those are the exceptions. The rest of the time, the longer, the better. Variable names should be nouns, and they should be dripping in adjectives. And I'm offering you some that you may find useful in your travels. Next, employee. Current, order. Remaining, work. I hate when people give a name that is nothing but the type. Employee, E. Like, what have I learned about this employee? Absolutely nothing, right? A vector of policy, policies, plural. Singular and plural is a big deal. It makes grepping really hard for words that change their spelling. There are also, of course, words in English that are the same singular and plural. Like, I don't know if any of you would have to do farm management, but like sheep is for one sheep and for many sheep. And there are other languages in which the natural words don't change when you pluralize them. So it's not helpful. Why do I want a bunch of policies? And as for double D, my goodness me. And D1, D2, D3, D4 is not better. I could retire if I just could get a very small amount of money for every single letter or single letter followed by a number double. And only doubles. It would be more than enough. I could retire well. So there's no information in double D or employee E. Don't do that. Yes? Why? Look, it's on the slide. Why do you want a bunch of policies? Are these all the active ones? Are these the ones that got bought yesterday? Are these the ones you're going to search through in order to find the thing you're like, I don't know, right? Because I made it up because it's on the slide. But if you need to make a vector of well, what are they? Are they all the in the world? Probably not, right? So put that in its name, the purpose. And yes, people grepping your code, don't make them hate you. The only thing worse than no hits is 7,402 hits, Actually, seriously, code reviewed some code by someone who went and got all the active, let's say, tests and put it in a variable called active employees and then dealt with it and then returned. And I'm like, it's not employees, it's tests. Yeah, but I copied this code from the same function for employees, and I don't want to change any of the variable names because I understand it. Okay, well, that's a thing. That's an approach. I wouldn't call it recommended. Abbreviations. Generally bad, right? ID is almost not an abbreviation. Info, as in contact info, order info, almost not an abbreviation. I will give you exemptions for those two, but that's about the end of it. A lot of people say, well, I'll just go with the first syllable, like EMP, EMP for employee. A lot of these techniques are kind of right only. They're very easy to generate these names, but they're kind of a little harder to go the other direction of reading the name and understanding what it was meant to be. Take these. Any guesses? These are all real. They were all in the same program. They are obviously annual revenue, total income. And by the way, revenue and income were exactly the same thing in this program. Some of the developers like to call it revenue, and some of the developers like to call it income. There was no, well, that's before expenses or before taxes. No, just two words for the same thing. And RD, revenue difference or perhaps revenue delta. Yeah, don't do that. Don't be that person. Vowels, as they say, are free. I mean, I did start programming in languages where we were limited to how many characters could be in a variable name, 6 or 8 if you were lucky. These restrictions no longer hold. Just glory in it. Go ahead and have an 11-letter name if you want. Templates, and if you're not a C++ person, generics in your language, basically, look, if you're writing a templated function, you're writing a function. So I talked about how to name functions. If you're writing a templated class, I've talked about how to name classes, but then there's the type names. So first of all, there's this. Hands up if you're a class T person. Type name T. Oh yeah, the tide has turned. We're all type name T. It's a little more typing. It's more letters. Compiler does not care, like at all. I do know people who are like, if it's okay to give you an int, I'll go type name. But if it's going to have member functions that I intend to call, I'm going to go class. Like, please, we have concepts. You don't need to do that. But what about the type names themselves? Good old T. Well, if there's only one, sure, T. Is Oliver in here? That's his mug, cup of tea. But the minute it's 2, you got to be meaningful. I know you've probably seen examples where it's T and U, T and V, T, U, and V, but we're back to Nicole and the newbies can shorten them down once they get it. It's not okay. Yes? You could, in fact, be meaningful with just one. Absolutely. If you would like to be meaningful with just one, that's great. T is so universal as this is for anything. But if, in fact, there's only one kind of thing it could be, then that argues away from T and towards meaningful names, for sure. This is from the Microsoft implementation of the standard library. We have basic string, and you see that it's LM, traits, and alloc. So they're very, very space constrained when they're implementing the standard library, but they've spent themselves on, 5 entire characters. Now, you can't copy this, you can't use underscore capital letter, okay? But you could leave off the underscore, and your thing could have one class that's an LM, one class that's a trait, one class that's an alloc. The second one is vector, where we have tie and alloc for the type and the allocator. It just makes everything easier to understand. Now, if C++ had a motto, well, it would probably be it's your foot, but if we were allowed 2 mottos, the second motto would be it depends. But the answer to this question is not it depends. There is one answer to the question, when does naming happen? When you know what it is. Now that depends. So sometimes before you write the code, you're designing it, and you're like, every employee is associated with a department. Those are names, probably the names of classes. When you're writing out an algorithm, we're going to take all the items, figure out their price, check their status. You're naming pieces. But it's pretty common to me that I've been elbows deep in code for a long time when I suddenly understand that D4 is the foreign sales tax. That's why it's almost never set. And then I rename it from D4 to foreign sales tax. You should never write yourself a note to fix a name later. The moment you know what it is, you should fix its name. Figure out how to work the tools you have. Fix names. Another tweet. I downloaded a mobile game the other day. They used to call their magic users mages, but they've changed that. I know they just did find and replace, so damage became da wizard. The first time you go to change a name and you don't use your refactoring tool, I want you to think da wizard and use a refactoring tool. As you saw with set status, a name can be right, and then over time, it drifts away from being right. That's when you change it. You know what it used to be, now you know what it is today. You give it a new name today. Especially when you're refactoring, you don't always know what a name is going to end up being, but it can also happen when you're building from scratch. We're going to have to process all the orders somehow. Process is a terrible name, but it can be a temporary name, as long as you remember to get it its proper name eventually. Do not give it a rude name that you hope will be caught by, for example, legal review before you go live. First of all, they're not always caught. And secondly, that's an incredibly expensive catch, okay? Do not call your function Steve is an idiot. If you haven't seen emotional code, there's a function I refer to there as undo Steve's nonsense, but it was a somewhat earthier word than nonsense in the original. Don't do that. Okay? Especially don't do that as a way to make sure you remember to give it its name. Do some stupid, no, don't do that. There's nothing you can do in your code to help you remember to come back and change your code. You can leave comments, you can do this, you can do that, those don't work. You gotta go outside your code into however you remember to do things, to-do list, Jira, I don't know, something, and give yourself a task to give it its proper name. Here's what happens to me. I'll come into a shop where people don't understand their code and can't change it because they don't understand it. And I'll say, wow, process is 5,000 lines long. And they say, yes. I say, sounds like it's the heart of your business. Absolutely. This is where the magic happens. That's great. What does it do? We don't know. And they don't. Like, nobody knows what it does, and it's 5,000 lines long. And the reason it's called process is because they don't know what it actually does. When you say, we can't move on until this is called whatever the heck it's called, and main engine loop is not a better substitute, they have to understand it. So somebody goes through and says, well, I know that these 5 function calls at the beginning are for this. And someone else says, well, this 100 lines is for that. And as they come to understand the pieces of it, they come to understand it, and they can name it. It takes a while, but it's worth doing. Things are generally hard to name because they're the wrong size. If you insist that it's not okay to just call it stuff and thing and data and process and update, that also makes things the right size. Just by insisting on names, without coming in with opinions about what right size might be, by only insisting on the name, stuff becomes the right size. And then the code tells a story. First we check for permissions, then we load, then we send the notifications. That makes sense. If I insist your code needs to tell me a story, it makes people give me good names. And the story is actually the important part. The number one thing you can do to become a better namer is to care. Things are called Steve's nonsense and process and stuff and leftovers and miscellaneous because the person who's writing it doesn't have time to care today. If you think about the reason this class exists, the reason this function exists, the reason this variable exists, then they're pretty easy to name. Why do I need a variable and I'm going to initialize an employee? What's that all about? Is this a new employee I'm going to add to the database? Oh, I guess I just named my variable. It's okay if you can't come up with a name at the moment you first write the thing, but you must fix it later. It's perfectly normal for things to get their proper names later, but you must give them their proper names later. Finally, demand good names every time. No more ABC, no more foo and bar, real names every time when you're doing it, when other people are doing it, even on slides, even in the documentation examples, even, I say, as though those aren't the places everybody copies from for the rest of time, okay? Demand it. Fix names when you find out the name is not matching the identity. Whoa, this is the outstanding total balance. seems like it should be called outstanding total balance and not F11. If you change it, change its name as well, and be consistent. That will make everything easier for people who are trying to decipher these like messages from the past that the names are. Because naming is hard, but we can and we should do it better. Please do. Thank you. I have 4.5 minutes for questions, but you're also welcome to approach me one-on-one afterwards. Hi.
Yeah, I was wondering why wouldn't you use velocity instead of...
Because if the formula is the formula, it's been memorized as, T equals V, blah, blah, blah. If you're in a scientific project by the scientists who told you the formula, it's not hard for acceleration time and velocity. Maybe you would switch those out. But if you have something like a distillation tower that you're simulating, it's entirely possible that some of the people don't share your opinion about what the letters stand for or just don't think that way. They'd be like, what's the Rx2 of this? And you're like, I don't know, I only have a reaction exchange delta, right? So you're making lookup tables. If someone wants to compare your code to a formula, the notation should be the same. Now, if there isn't a scientific formula and it's just everybody knows that density is, weight divided by volume, sure, spell them out, that's fine. But when there is an official scientific formula that's being implemented in the code should match that. Yeah. Hi.
Not sure if you mentioned it, but what is your take on units in the name, like time?
Yeah, units in the name. So calling it something like contract length days is better than just calling it contract length and it being an integer. But it's not your only solution. Specifically for time, like use chrono, right? And then you can literally represent 30 days or 1 year or whatever you want to represent in the type. If it's like meters versus kilograms or whatever, and you don't want to go all the way to like a strong typed library where it's not possible to add meters and kilograms because there are different types, then maybe put the type in the name like that. But it's not the best solution to the problem. I mean, you can argue like annual salary versus salary is putting the units, right? Dollars per year, dollars per month. So it's not always wrong. But it may indicate that you have a bigger problem that you need to attack another way. Hi. Right, so units like whether this is radians versus degrees, Fahrenheit versus Celsius. Like, if you have one thing in your whole system that has that distinction, then maybe names alone will take care of it. But if you're building like an entire graphical library and you're relying just on prefixes and suffixes in your variable names, that's probably not a great strategy, right? So that's a very it depends answer. But whenever I start seeing these type decorations and units as a kind of type, I'm looking for a bigger picture problem. Now, not everything needs a bigger picture, but if it's pervasive, then you would be better off using some kind of a framework of strong types rather than name decorations. Yeah. Hi. Love name. So I love namespaces. I'm going to say don't overdo it, but I've met very few people who actually overdo it. Most people, you're lucky if they put their whole thing in one namespace, which is the name of their project. If you do it too much, then it's not just that it's more typing and more reading, but people might get confused, especially if you're doing it because there are name collisions. So like right now with stood whatever and stood ranges whatever, that's uncomfortable to me because if people put the usings in, then I don't know literally which sort they're calling, right? But if you don't put the things in, then you're typing the whole names out. So don't break things down too small. I would definitely say that. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, I guess I have two comments, or maybe something that you could maybe clarify. There was the abstraction slide you had where I was just thinking that maybe that there's quite a lot of computing, well-used computing metaphors.
Yes.
So window,
right.
pointer, so on. And
sometimes the metaphors outlive. So, you know, the save icon is like a floppy disk. And some of you have seen a floppy disk, but some of you have not, right? But that's still, we just recognize it as the save icon. So I think the case of window and button and so forth and so on, that's well established.
The second was, I work in projects where there are a lot of scientists, and there's kind of this tension where, like you mentioned, that they very much would like it to be T instead of time and row instead of density and so on, but then this name sort of crosses a boundary and suddenly it's not appropriate anymore, and you kind of have this fight about, no, it should be row, and no, please, now we say density. So I don't know if you have any, it kind of happens organically where...
So this may happen with scientists where they would argue about calling something density versus calling it row. What I ask is, like, how's the conversation going to go? When there's a bug and somebody phones somebody and they're going through it, does anyone say, well, what's its row? Because if they do, then I want it to be called row everywhere. But if they are looking at a report and it says density across the top of the column of the report, then that kind of argues for it being called density. So, and there's a boundary. Maybe it's called this in the UI layer and actually called something different in the engine layer. But then hopefully we have a marshalling layer to sort that out. Because these names do persist throughout many levels of conversation, for sure. You're welcome to come and talk to me more one-on-one, but now I'm going to free you for a break, and thank you for your time.